Well, hello again, everyone. It's nice to see you all. It's especially nice for me to be back on the Enterprise. Just a quick recap of where we've been. We got back through the wormhole. We're back in current time, 2266. We are no longer at 19th century Earth. We have saved Earth from the Romulans. All that we can talk about another time, because today what I want to do is talk about the period in U.S. history called Reconstruction. And this is a tragic period in U.S. history for the freedmen, for the former slaves. It starts out with such hope and ends so poorly. And we're going to talk about that today. And we're going to pick up the story really before the war ends. You remember that the war will end with the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in April of 1865. And we're going to pick it up even before that in 1864 as Sherman reaches Savannah around the 22nd of December of 1864, and he presents Lincoln Savannah, the city of Savannah, as a Christmas gift. He writes a letter about that to the president. But what this has to do with Reconstruction is that as Sherman's armies went through Georgia, they would read the Emancipation Proclamation. And so what happens is by the time that Sherman arrives in Savannah, there are tens of thousands of freedmen that are following along after the army. And the question is now what to do with these newly freed peoples. And so what happens is that Sherman will call a meeting, and that meeting will be with leaders from the African-American community. It will be with the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, will attend. And this is one of the bright spots in this whole story, because what happens is that freedmen themselves get to talk about what freedom means to them and what that would look like moving forward. And here is a quote from Garrison Frazier, who was one of the spokespeople for the African-American community at this significant meeting. He says, the way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land and turn it and till it by our own labor, that is, by the labor of the women and children and old men, and we can soon maintain ourselves and have something to spare. And to assist the government, the young men should enlist in the service of the government and serve in such manner as they may be wanted. We wanted to be placed on land until we are able to buy it and make it our own. Okay, so that's what he is saying. He's saying, give us some land, give us some time. We would be happy to serve the government in some way. And so as a result of this, Sherman will issue Special Field Order 15. And Special Field Order 15 basically reflects what Garrison Frazier said. It takes the Sea Islands around the Carolinas and Georgia that had been abandoned and gives them 40 acres to each family. And it also allows for some provision for freedmen to join the military if they'd like, and just like Frazier said. And so what happens is that many freedmen take the offer of this 40 acres. There are also hundreds and if not thousands of mules that have been pulling these wagons of supplies. And by the time they would get back to Washington, D.C., there wouldn't be much left of them. And so Sherman says, well, you can have a mule as well. And this is where the term 40 acres and a mule comes from. And so this is looking very good as we then get to April of 1865 and the end of the war. Now, as this is happening, there are four big questions that come up with Reconstruction. And these are the questions that I'm going to endeavor to answer as we talk about this today. The first question is, how is the South that has been physically devastated by war and socially changed by war be rebuilt? So the first question is the rebuilding question. The second question is, how are liberated men and women going to fare as freedmen? And we've already begun to see that with Special Field Order 15. And then the question becomes, how will the Southern states be reintegrated into the Union, which is a big question, right? And then who's going to direct that process of reintegration? Is it going to be the president? Is it going to be the Congress? Or is it going to be those Southern states themselves? And so all of these questions are at the forefront of everyone's mind as the war comes to a conclusion in 1865. And one of the things that happens first at the federal level is the establishment of what's called the Freedmen's Bureau. And it is the task of the Freedmen's Bureau to address that second question primarily, is how Black men and women are going to fare as freed men and women. The Freedmen's Bureau will establish schools, will send people to help in the process of this transition from enslavement to freedom and that sort of thing. And the person that is in charge of this is Oliver Otis Howard. He was called the one-armed general. He lost an arm in the Civil War. And he really did have a heart for helping these folks. And that is a positive for the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, what will happen is that the newly minted president, after Lincoln's assassination in April of 1865, Andrew Johnson, will not like the Freedmen's Bureau. And this becomes a big battle into the 1870s. On another front, even before Lincoln is assassinated, there is talk of and action on some constitutional amendments which will change the face of Reconstruction. And the first of these that Lincoln is involved in before his untimely assassination is the 13th Amendment. And so the 13th Amendment is ratified in 1865, the same year that the war ends. And it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Now, this is almost and that's a big almost, a total abolition of slavery. That little phrase about except as a punishment becomes a huge, huge issue almost right away. And we'll talk about that as well. But that's the 13th Amendment, and that is what abolishes slavery in the United States. It is not the Emancipation Proclamation. As you'll recall, the Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves in the rebellious states, because Lincoln wanted to keep those so-called border states with the Union. And so it is the 13th Amendment that will end slavery in the United States. Let's talk about Andrew Johnson for just a minute. Andrew Johnson becomes president. He is Lincoln's second vice president. He is from Tennessee, and as you remember from our discussion of the election of 1864, his kind of being put on the ticket was to try and pull those border states toward the Union. He is a Southerner from Tennessee, but he was not a secessionist. He was the occupation governor of Tennessee. And so on paper, this looks very good for Lincoln. You know, this is going to pull the border states toward the Union. We saw that happened in some cases, not in the case of Kentucky, most notably, however. But Andrew Johnson was probably As it turns out, one of the worst choices that Lincoln could have made. Andrew Johnson was very much a Southerner with very much Southern attitudes from this time period. In fact, at his inaugural address, the vice president gave inaugural addresses back then. He had a little too much to drink, and he just went off script and started a racist diatribe. And this would kind of set the tone for Andrew Johnson's time in office. Andrew Johnson would be at loggerheads with Congress almost from the outset, which will lead to his impeachment in 1868. And we will talk about that when we get into the plans for Reconstruction. And so let's talk about the plans for Reconstruction. The first plan that I want to talk about a little bit is Lincoln's plan. Lincoln certainly had a plan for Reconstruction before he left this earth, and it was called, nicknamed the 10% plan. Lincoln had always maintained that it was only a few hotheads in each Southern state that really led secession, and he didn't want to punish everyone for that. So he said, when 10% of the voting populace from the election of 1860, which was the last election before the war, pledge allegiance to the United States, then those states can apply to come back into the Union. So it was a very lenient way to let the states back in. And it would have been interesting to see how Lincoln would have conducted this had he lived. But what happens is that this mantle will be passed to Johnson. Johnson will take this 10% plan and amend it a little bit, but he also wanted to bring the Southern states in very quickly and very easily, but not for the same reasons that Lincoln did. Lincoln had healing on his mind. Johnson just wanted to get back to business as usual. Johnson will let these states come back in, and to the shock of many U.S. Congress people, some of the same Southerners that led secession, even the vice president of the Confederacy, will come back into Congress right away. And this is just flabbergasting to the Congress as we're coming up on the midterm elections in 1866. In addition, I told you that Johnson was against the Freedmen's Bureau and tried to defund it and tried to do anything he could to destroy it. He also was kind of resentful of the upper classes of Southern society before the war. He came from the lower white classes of society. And so to kind of say, okay, you have to acknowledge my power. If someone had owned over 100 slaves before the war, they had to petition personally to the president to get back into the Union. And this was just a petty way of Johnson asserting his power. But what happened was that a lot of states come back in very quickly, and not surprisingly, when this happens, the slave codes from before the war will try to come back as well now as what were called black codes. And literally, in some cases, the word slave was scratched out and freedman was put in. And so it kept this caste system. Congress said no way. And so around the time of the midterm elections of 1866, Congress will try and do something about this. So what happens is that in 1866, there are these midterm elections, and Reconstruction is on the mind of many, many people in this election. And so what happens is that Johnson will go and he will campaign for some of the candidates that he wants to see in Congress that would support his agenda. But what happens, unfortunately, for these candidates is that the crowd will begin to heckle the president, and the president will start to heckle back and just act very unpresidential. And so what this does is it then allows for what the folks that are called the radical Republicans to be elected into Congress and to be elected into what is called a veto-proof Congress, which means that they control over 2/3 of both chambers of Congress, both the House and the Senate, and so they can override any of the president's vetoes. And so this takes away one of the checks and balances in this time period, but arguably Johnson helped to do that to himself. And this really starts just a huge fight between Johnson, who wants to control the reins of Reconstruction, and the newly elected Congress. Now, what will happen is that when Congress comes into session, one of the first things that they do is they will pass a Reconstruction Act, which will take power from the president and give it to Congress. Now, this is the Reconstruction Act, which will start eventually military reconstruction. The South will be divided into 5 kind of zones and called military districts, and Reconstruction will be overseen by the military to make sure that freedmen get to vote and that things are progressing in a more equitable way. But this causes great resentment in the South, and this will be another issue as we dig further into Reconstruction. Congress will also during this time pass a civil rights bill to try and put some teeth to giving freedmen's rights, and they will also, in this early period, construct one of the most significant pieces of constitutional legislation ever passed, and this was the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment will define citizenship, and it will also, for the first time, apply the rights of the Bill of Rights to the states. And this had never been done before, and this was an attempt again to keep the South from going back to the way things were before. And so the 14th Amendment had really good intentions, as we will see later on. And when we get into the 1870s, the Supreme Court will interpret the 14th Amendment so narrowly that it really takes the teeth out of it, unfortunately. But this leads to a huge smackdown between Congress and the president. And in fact, the president will rail about this in his cabinet meetings. And what will happen is that one of the cabinet members, the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, is a good friend of some of the folks in Congress that are the radical Republicans. And so he will go and tell on a regular basis these radical Republicans what the president was ranting about today. And this makes the president mad. And so he threatens to fire Edwin Stanton. The Congress will then say, no, you can't do that. And the president says, watch me. And the Congress passes a bill, a law called the Tenure of Office Act that says if a president dies while in office, the new president has to hang on to the old president's cabinet. This makes Johnson mad, so he fires Edwin Stanton, which is a violation of the Tenure of Office Act, which leads to his impeachment. He is impeached by the House of Representatives, but found not guilty at his impeachment trial in the Senate by 1 vote in 1868. So that is just a crazy smackdown over who will control Reconstruction in this early period. And so what happens is that that the Reconstruction Act will go into effect, military reconstruction will go into effect, and this will be, in the short term, kind of a good thing for freedmen, because they have some relative safety with Union troops still occupying that. What will happen as a result is a kind of a backlash to this, is that in early '67, that terror organization, the Ku Klux Klan, will be formed to try and subvert this whole thing. So things are just heating up and heating up. Meanwhile, let's talk a little bit about the women's rights movement of this time period. You remember that the women's rights movement had really gained some traction after the Seneca Falls Convention and the Declaration of Sentiments in 1848. And they had thrown the weight of their growing movement toward abolitionism during this time period, thinking that when African Americans get their freedom, women will get their freedom as well, because many of the laws around property rights, around rights in general, applied both to slaves, the slave population, and to women as well. And so there was this expectation that the government would not be hypocritical and give one group rights but not the other, but that's exactly what happened. And it was a profound disappointment for people like Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and others. And it will actually break the women's movement in two, where there's one group that still is working toward a national constitutional amendment to give women more rights, and then there is a state by state by state, more grassroots organization that forms. And the issue after the Civil War with women's rights becomes suffrage, becomes voting. So you have the National Women's Suffrage Association, which is working at the national level, and you have the American Women's Suffrage Association, which will be working state by state by state. These two groups will work independently of one another for the same goal, ultimately, until the 1890s, and then they will come together and form the NAWSA, or NASA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, in the late 1800s. But this is just an unbelievable setback for the women's rights movement during this time period. By the time we get to 1870, Congress also passes a third and significant constitutional amendment. This is the 15th Amendment, and this gives African American men the right to vote. Now, another profound disappointment of the women's movement was that the 14th Amendment, for the first time in the entire Constitution, will use the word male specifically. And then, to add insult to injury, the 15th Amendment comes along and only gives Black males the right to vote. And so this further kicks the women's movement back on their heels. And we'll talk more about how they come out of that later on. And so what happens is that Reconstruction will go on. There will be a presidential election in 1868. The war hero Grant will be elected. There is a lot of corruption, and we'll talk about that corruption later as we get into the industrial period. But what happens is that Reconstruction will kind of get out of the forefront of the minds of many congressmen. And what will happen is that as that happens, Southern states themselves will begin to take control of Reconstruction. And there are lots of negative consequences to all of this. what happens is that these begin to be the beginnings of what become known as the Jim Crow laws and the era of Jim Crow, where this caste system, where African Americans are absolutely discriminated against, is becoming codified into law. A lot of that has to do with laws around voting by the 1890s, and that sort of thing. And that is kind of represented if we go back to Sherman's Special Field Order 15. Now, you remember that this was a very hopeful beginning back in 1860, 64, 65 with the Special Field Order. What happens is that those owners of that property, that land on the Sea Islands, when the war is over, will start to sue to get their land back, that it's no longer abandoned lands, and the courts will side with the property owners. And so it doesn't take very long for these freedmen to suffer more and more and more on this land and eventually get kicked off of it. And that is emblematic of kind of what happens throughout Reconstruction to freedmen. And so that's kind of what's going on there. Eventually what will happen is that we get to the election of 1876. The election of 1876 will be the deciding factor that will end Reconstruction. And what happens is that 3 southern states will send in 2 sets of ballots to force the issue of Reconstruction. So they'll send in 2 sets of ballots, one having the Republican Hayes winning and one having the Democrat Tilden winning. And together these states could throw the election one way or another. What will happen is that there is a congressional committee that is formed, and with 15 people, and half of those people are Republicans and half of them are Democrats. And then the chairperson was supposed to be originally one of the justices on the Supreme Court, but they all said, no, that's your job. And so it ended up being a Republican on the committee. And so the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, will win. But the negotiation with the Democrats is that if we give you your candidate, Hayes, then you will give us an end to Reconstruction. And so what happens is that Hayes will be elected finally to the presidency, and then the Compromise of 1877 comes around, and that will end Reconstruction in the United States. And as you have clearly seen, hopefully, the freedmen are the people that are unfortunately sacrificed for the end of Reconstruction, and for almost the better part of another century will be just exploited under this caste system of the Jim Crow era. And that is a sad end to this story. But let's quickly go back to the questions that I started with and make sure that you understand what perhaps some answers would be to these 4 questions. How is the South going to be rebuilt? Well, the short answer to that is the South gets to rebuild itself, and it rebuilds itself into another version of kind of the antebellum slave South, with the sharecrop system, with voting restrictions, with Jim Crow laws eventually, and that sort of thing. How will liberated blacks fare as free men and women? There was hope at the beginning, and then those hopes were dashed. How will the southern states be reintegrated into the Union? They come in, then they're kicked back out, and then they come in under congressional Reconstruction, which is a much more harsh way to come in from their perspective, because they have to sign on to the 13th, 14th, and eventually the 15th Amendments as well. And then there's this ironclad oath where 50% of voters have to say that they were never loyal to the South in the first place, and that sort of thing. So that's the answer to that question. And then who's going to direct the process of Reconstruction? Well, that's a bigger question, right? It starts out with the president, then it goes to Congress, and eventually it will go to the states themselves. So there's this change over time that we see. So that's how we come to answer these questions, and that is a quick look at Reconstruction. Thanks for your attention today, and I'm glad to be back on the Enterprise, and we will see you next time to maybe talk about the West.